Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to begin talking about the early republic and the first U.S. government under the Constitution. And like we talked about in class, before the Constitution has to take effect, it's going to have to be ratified or voted on by at least 9 states. And so the debate that we talk about in class about should the states give up their autonomy to create the federal government is going to play out right after the Constitutional Convention. On the one side is going to be a group called the Federalists, and they're going to support the Constitution. And their main challenge is they have to convince Americans who are fearful of a central government that this system would both protect the states, the individual rights of the citizens, and do all the things that a federal government needs to do. The main people advocating on behalf of the Federalists were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who between the three of them wrote a series of essays called the Federalists, or the Federalist Papers, that were published throughout the colonies in order to the states, in order to try to convince the people of the goodness of the Constitution. Their main arguments are that the states would still have many powers under this federal government, that trade and taxes were very important to the success of the new nation, and so they needed a federal government in order to regulate those to solve the problems of the Articles of Confederation. They also make an argument about Western expansion, that there will need to be a strong United States government in order to create new states in the Western territories. Squaring off against the Federalists are a group that is going to end up calling themselves the Anti Federalists, led by Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and George Mason. Basically, their concern is who is going to have more power in this new government, the states or the national government. So they're going to embody the spirit of 76, the revolutionary spirit, that fears strong central government, believing that any strong central government is going to oppress the people, take away the right to self-rule, and ultimately would favor the rich who would have more access to that federal government. And at the very least, the Anti-Federalists believed that a Bill of Rights would be necessary in order to ensure the rights of the people in this new system. And so over the next couple of years, the Federalists are going to win the debate for ratification, but it's going to be close. As you can see in the chart on the right, a lot of these votes were actually very close, but eventually all the states ended up ratifying the Constitution, though you can see some of them, such as Rhode Island, were decided only by 2 votes. And so the votes are going to be very, very close. And in many cases, the Federalists are going to win because they promise those opposing the Constitution that they would add a Bill of Rights as one of the first acts of Congress. And so, after all the states ratified, the first election was held from December of 1788 to January of 1789, in which the first Congress, the first Senate, and the first President, George Washington, were elected. And the first government of the United States is not going to be in Washington, D.C. That didn't exist yet. The first U.S. government is actually going to be in New York at a place called Federal Hall. And the first U.S. government is going to face a lot of challenges. They elect George Washington unanimously because everyone believed that he was in the best position to kind of be trusted with the power of the presidency. And so once this government was elected, they had to create the first bureaucracy, the first set of institutions, as well as the cabinet of advisors for carrying out the laws and the powers of the executive. It had never been done before. And so the first government creates the Department of State and named Thomas Jefferson the first Secretary of State. And that institution was in charge of handling international relations, ambassadors, and other things. Next, the Treasury Department was created and placed in the hands of Alexander Hamilton, one of George Washington's kind of trusted advisors from the Revolutionary War. And they were tasked with managing the government's revenue and printing money. The Army and Navy were entrusted to the Department of War under Henry Knox as the Secretary of War, another Revolutionary War veteran. And then finally, the Office of the Attorney General, given to Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph, was created to advise the government on legal questions and to advise George Washington, as well as to represent the government in any cases that went to the Supreme Court. And so that first cabinet is going to be very small. Today, the president's cabinet, or group of advisors, has grown considerably, and each of them is in charge of managing the institution to carry out their particular task of government. The first U.S. government also set up the Judicial Branch, and at first the courts were actually very weak. The U.S. Supreme Court did not have the power of judicial review to judge laws unconstitutional. They only basically heard cases where people wanted to sue the government. In the Judiciary Act of 1789, Congress created the federal court system with 13 district courts, 3 courts of appeals, and a Supreme Court which placed John Jay, the prominent Federalist, as the Chief Justice. The first Congress also met in 1789, and immediately they looked to pass a Bill of Rights. The Federalists, such as James Madison, felt that this was necessary, that they had to keep their promise to the rest of the nation to pass a Bill of Rights. And so, 10 amendments to the Constitution were eventually ratified by the states and took effect in what we now call the Bill of Rights, and which limited the power of the federal government. They also set about creating the first taxes for the new government. In the Tariff of 1789, the U.S. government decided to tax trade, but there was a problem with this. Southern farmers saw it as unfairly affecting them, which was kind of the first sign of conflict in the North-South regional rivalry that would eventually lead to the American Civil War. The farmers relied on trade with foreign nations in order to make their profits, and they bought more imported goods than people in the North. And so, at the very outset, deep divisions between North and South over the economy caused conflict in the U.S. government. And the first U.S. government faced its first major crisis in 1791, when the Congress passed a tax on whiskey. Now, whiskey, especially in the U.S. West and in the rural parts of the country, oftentimes served as currency and was considered to be kind of a right. And so, by 1794, all of the kind of discontent and anger over the whiskey tax erupted into civil unrest known as the Whiskey Rebellion. If you remember Shays' Rebellion, it's a similar instance of kind of a popular uprising against something that the government is doing. But this time, unlike Shays' Rebellion, the United States Army, with 15,000 soldiers, showed the legitimacy of this government by putting down the rebellion using the federal army. However, this use of the military against the citizens worried many Americans, including the Anti Federalists, who had opposed the strong central government. So again, deep divisions are already developing. And the next major issue that the government would have to face is how to pay for the federal government. And for that, we're going to be looking at a couple of sources in class from Alexander Hamilton, the architect of the American economic system.